Hello and welcome to Restoration DIY, and whether you're new or returning, it's great to have you here and I hope you enjoyed the video. In this episode I'll be making a vase from Sapele, ash and oak segmented rings. This is a bit different to my usual project, so without further ado, let's get into it. Originally this project was going to be a hybrid of epoxy resin and wood, but the epoxy delivery was delayed, so I had to adapt the design. So this will now have 8 segmented rings, each made up of 18 segments. 6 rings of Sapele and 2 will be a mix of ash and oak, and there'll be a solid piece of Sapele for the base. I won't show all the segments being cut, but when they were done, I assembled the rings. The first 4 Sapele rings were all the same diameter. The 2 ash and oak rings were the biggest. And then the last 2 Sapele rings, they were designed to fit in between, to bridge the gap. All 8 rings went together in much the same way. The 2 ash and oak rings differed in that I alternated the segments to give them a subtle checkerboard effect. And with all of them done, I left them overnight for the glue to cure. So it's the next day and all the rings are ready for sanding on the drum sander. This is done to level the surfaces, ready for gluing the blank together. I began by passing the rings through, just skimming the surface. Then I gradually lower the drum, being careful not to overdo it. And just for note, this has a new loading of 100 grit sandpaper after ruining the last one with hot melt glue. After sanding, I moved on to the glue up. In this session, I'd be making 2 halves of the blank. The upper section was first. I applied a liberal amount of Titebond 2 and began stacking the rings in a half bond pattern. To prevent the joints sliding around, I used hot melt glue to hold everything nice and secure. After applying hot melt glue, I added lots of weight to squeeze the joints and remove the gaps. Then I moved on to the lower section. The feature rings were first. I stacked these with vertical joints with opposing segments of ash and oak. Then the remaining Sapele rings were added in a half bond pattern. And finally, a solid piece of Sapele was glued on. This had been turned down on the lathe and a mortise added to make it easier to fix it to the lathe. These were then left overnight for the glue to fully cure. Another day has passed and it was time to begin roughly shaping the outside and, more importantly, fully shaping and adding a finish to the inside of both halves. The lower section was first. With the workpiece tightly clamped in the 4-jaw chuck, I set 2 balancing the blank. But there was a lot of overhanging weight and, inevitably, I got a slight catch which pulled the blank off the chuck, sending it flying. Anyway, lesson learned. After refixing it to the chuck, I placed a piece of ash in the blank and used a tailstock to apply pressure to the base. This held everything nice and secure. All sorted, I turned the lathe speed up to around 450 RPM and set to removing material with a 1/2-inch bowl gouge, shear scraping the high spots and using push cuts to level the surface. At this point I wasn't thinking too much about the final shape. For now, I just wanted to get rid of a lot of the weight, because to finish the inside I would have to remove the tailstock support, and I didn't want the blank to exit the lathe again. I soon had the blank balanced, and after removing the last few layers of material, I started on the inside. I was reluctant to remove the support straight away. This restricted access and my choice of tools I could use. To begin with, I used a bowl gouge and a 1/4 inch parting tool. I figured if I got the top 2 rings where I needed them to be, I could then move on to doing the lower section. Once the support was out of the way, I broke out the side cutting scraper. I was more than a bit concerned this would grab and cause a problem, but after a resharpen, the cutting edge sliced through the segments with no issues at all. When I got into the lower part, the scraper was causing a bit of vibration on the face of the uneven segments, so I switched to the full-size carbide cutter to level things up. Then it was back to the scraper to hog out material in the base. To finish off shaping, I used the large inboard bowl scraper, working the blade from top to bottom, smoothing the surface. Not knowing the final shape of the finished piece, I left plenty of thickness in the side wall, particularly in the base, where I may or may not have a deep cutout. After sanding from 80 to 400 grit, I cleaned down with denatured alcohol, applied 2 liberal coats of sanding sealer, then a single application of Yorkshire Grit, thoroughly cleaned away, and to finish, Hampshire Sheen gloss finishing wax. Finish applied, I leveled the top face, and then I did the top section. The top section was done in the same way as the lower, though this was much shorter, so I didn't have to worry about it flying off the lathe. The Sapele cut very easily with a 1/2 inch bowl gouge, and as before, I was only looking to balance the blank and finish the inside. Doing the inside was very easy. The bowl gouge took care of removing the excess of material, and as with the lower section, I only removed enough to get a nice shape, then I sanded and applied the finish. With both halves done, I could glue them together. This is why I fully finished the inside. It'll be near enough impossible to get access once this is done. I applied a good coat of Type Bond 2 to the top half, and with the lower half in the chuck, I stuck the 2 together and aligned them. Then I used a tailstock to add clamping pressure. After a couple of minutes I wanted to make a slight adjustment, but try as I might, I couldn't split the 2 halves, so I reapplied pressure and left it to cure until the next day. It's now 2 days later, and the final shaping can begin. I decided this piece would be a vase with a pedestal, so with it firmly clamped in the chuck and the tailstock, I used the bowl gouge to start the cutout. The majority of the recess would be in the solid piece of Sapele, which would then flow up into the first segmented ring, being careful not to cut all the way through to the inside. Moving on from the cutout, I could see the opportunity to explore a curvy shape from the feature ring down to the base, so I went at it, shear scraping the surface, blending the curves together. This wasn't really working out, so I turned my attention to the top half. The top was looking very heavy, so I went for another cutout. This would be more pronounced than the one in the base. For this, I used a smaller 3/8 bowl gouge, cutting on either side of the recess until I got near to the required depth. I really enjoy working with Sapele. It cuts so easily and doesn't tear or rip. Going back to the lower half, I could see the curvy shape wasn't going to work, so using a bowl gouge, I ran a push cut down into the cutout, shear scraping to further refine the shape up into the feature ring. The skew chisel was next, blending and fairing the surface. This has turned into a fairly simple shaped piece, so it was important to get the curves just so, eliminating any low spots and removing any blemishes. I was getting close to finishing the outside surface, but there was still the rim and the opening to do, so I did a quick touch up on the upper cutout and started on the top. Doing the rim was a bit of a risk. It had to be done, but the workpiece was only being held by the 4-jaw chuck, so working from the outside towards the centre, I very carefully cut away thin layers of material, and as my confidence grew, I began shear scraping the curves into the opening. Apart from a little bit from the skew chisel, the rest was done with a bowl gouge. The cutting action was very controllable and never threatened a catch, though I was only taking the lightest cuts and frequently checking the chuck was still tight in the mortise. After a final bit of blending and fairing, the rim was done. Some sanding with 80 grit cleaned up the last few tool marks, then it was back to finish the rest of the outer surface. The cutouts required a bit more work. The transition between the upper and lower cut lines needed to be sharpened up. I thought I could do this with a 3/8 bowl gouge, but the profile wasn't swept back quite enough, so I switched to the 1/2 inch detail spindle gouge. The spindle gouge has a swept back grind, making it perfect for this job, though it's not so great at shear scraping, so I still had to use the bowl gouge to clean up the cut line. And with the last few cuts made on the rim, that was it done. Then I gave it a thorough sanding from 80 to 600 grit. After sanding, I cleaned down with denatured alcohol. This was followed with 2 liberal coats of sanding sealer, each one denibbed with a non-abrasive Scotch pad. Next up, Yorkshire Grit, just a single coat, thoroughly cleaned away till no more residue is picking up on the paper towel. Then I applied a single coat of Wood Wax 22, which was polished off with paper towel, but to really help the finish, I used shavings to buff in a deep lustre. shavings definitely helped by burnishing the surface. And to finish, Hampshire Sheen Gloss Finishing Wax, just a single coat to seal and protect the surface. I use the shavings on this as well. It's something I'll be doing more of in the future. And that's it, another project finished. As I said at the beginning, due to the lack of epoxy resin, this was an alternative to what I wanted to do. But nonetheless, I think it turned out looking great, and I hope you like it too. The lighter coloured feature rings look just right set against the darker Sapele, and the chatoyance in the segments gives a 3D look to the surface. Anyway, with all that said, I'd like to thank you all for watching. Please subscribe, I'm getting close to 3,000 subs, so everyone counts. A thumbs up will be much appreciated, and comments are always welcome. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye for now.